Welcome to Brave. Be inspired by the best leaders of Southeast Asia tech. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. I'm Jeremy Au, a VC, founder, and father. Join us for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.jeremyau.com. Hey, Rachel, good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
I'm so excited because you're someone who's tackling the legal tech world and you have a good view on something that seems very arcane and complicated to a ton of founders. And so I'm sure that there'll be some interesting discussions that we're going to have, not only about your professional journey, but also your perspective on the startup and legal intersection in Southeast Asia. So, of course, before we jump into all that, tell us a little bit about yourself to those who don't know you yet.
So I'm Rachel. I'm the founder of a company called Founders Doc, which is a legal tech company. And I'm also the head of the corporate division at Eugene Thirasingham LLP, which is a local law firm. I started my journey in international firms as well as your big fours, so the big four law firms. And I decided to step out and explore how we can reimagine how lawyers deliver services to clients with Founders Doc.
That's amazing. So, let's talk a little bit and go back in time, right? So there you were, and somewhere along the way, after junior college, you decided that you wanted to go do law, right? So what drove that decision?
Yeah, so it isn't as romantic. I actually wanted to be a broadcaster, but my dad says no. And my dad was like, you got to do medicine. So as a rebellious move, I decided to do law. And the inspiration for it was a Hong Kong drama. So there was nothing romantic about how I ended up in law.
So it's like good reverse psychology by the parents. It's like, you don't become a doctor, but you become a lawyer, right? Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, my dad didn't really like lawyers. But because I was in debates, not a very good debater, but I was in debate. So the law schools just accepted me quite easily. So that was the natural calling of nature.
Okay, so you have been doing debate for a while, and so you felt like law was there. Um, so that does mean that you did have some pre-existing interest in at least the law side of it, right? What was your visuals of lawyer versus the actual reality of it? Like, you must have had a certain mental image of law, right, at that time.
Yeah, I mean anyone who has seen me debating would agree that I would not have made it to law school because I like to stand there and crack jokes and then the coach would be like, "Oh gosh, I just put her in the wrong place." In fact, if anyone trained me for law school, it would be my sisters because we were constantly fighting over the pen and the dresses that we wore. So my older sister takes credit for the fact that, okay, you're now in law school because I trained you well when you were a kid and we got into enough quarrels. And then I'll be like, yeah, mom, now I learned in law school that, you need to be given equal hearing. And I was not given my chance to give my case when I was younger. So I think that was a genesis for me getting into law school. And then watching Hong Kong dramas at that time, there was this very pretty lawyer with a pink feathery pen. And I was like, wow, becoming a lawyer, I can get this pink feathery pen, put it outside my door, and then, go to court and then win the case. So when I first started training, I actually bought a pink feathery pen, which I put in my cubicle. And I think all the other trainees looked at me and they were like, this weirdo, why you literally have this long pink feathery pen? So yeah, so that was how I started my journey as a lawyer, being the weirdo in class.
Well, I think it's pretty common, right? Because we were all kids, like we just watch movies and that's our articulation of it, right? Like I used to watch all these like, action movies, right, in the military, and then I'll be like, "Wow, national service be lots of fun." And we get to carry this stuff and look very macho, and you do get that, of course, but there's so much like, cleaning the rifles, waiting around, sweating, and then carrying the stuff, getting very fit, looking fit in a movie. and being
Like
attractive like
Brad
that
Pitt.
is very different from like Brad Pitt is very different from all the work you need to do for 2 years running around to get there, right?
Yeah.
So big difference between the actual reality and obviously the movie. So I've been there. And okay, so there you are at King's College, and you made an interesting decision, right? Which was you went into law school and you said, actually, I'm going to continue being a lawyer, right? Because a lot of folks at that point of time go into law school because of those movies and the drama serials and say, oops, I will graduate as a lawyer, but I will do something else, and you decided to continue being a lawyer. So what was that about?
So actually, my plan was to go to law school and then work as a lawyer and then go into advertising. And now in retrospect, I should have done that because Google and Facebook make so much money for advertising. And if I just stuck to it, I would become a tech billionaire. But I did the more silly path of just sticking on. What I enjoyed about law was I do corporate law, so I look at every agreement or contract like a story, and that was what I enjoyed since I was a kid. I liked biology and history because they narrate a story, and that's the way I see every agreement. And then I just like the space time that you have when you concentrate on something a little bit more complex, and then you try to make sense of it. So that's what really gets me going in law. And now I try to gel the two together. So I have, started producing cartoon videos for my clients, which is available for public view. And that is the way I try to get my bit of like social media advertising genes out and try to, let it, explore and groom itself.
So, I mean, that's a great skill to have, right? Because, the truth is everybody needs to do a little bit of that social media advertising for whatever they're building, right? And in this case, you spend pretty much, 8 years as a, lawyer, right? So I'm just kind of curious, what did you learn from 8 years of a lawyer so far?
I think I did learn quite a fair bit. So the beginning bits were quite administrative, and that is where the legal tech driving force comes from. The first few years, a lot of the tasks that was assigned to me were very administrative or paralegal-like in nature, which I felt like, can we do better? And then it's only when you start in your second or third or fourth year where you really you're pushed through to becoming like a real lawyer, and that's when the real grilling starts. So yeah, because I do M&A, so you picked up the skills in an M&A transaction, which you can probably not read up on. These are practical skills, which you have to pick up on the job.
What are some myths about the legal profession that you like to help us understand differently now?
Yeah, it's totally like Suits. 100%. I'm just kidding.
What is Suits for those who don't know yet? Can you explain what Suits is versus the reality?
Yeah, in a nutshell, in Suits, Rachel finds Prince Harry and becomes a princess. That's all. That's all you need to know from Suits. Um, yeah, Suits is a American TV drama about a lawyer, this very good-looking guy called Harvey Specter, and then he has this genius associate that helps him with his day-to-days, and then there's a bit of politics going on, all quite dramatic, but kind of true actually. I would say. Suits is just like all the fun things in a law firm compressed into a show. Some people say it's fake, but I've seen it in real life, so I think it's true.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of truth to that. There's a show I used to watch called House of Lies, which is about consultants lifestyle. And the funny part is when you watch it is like again, like you said, it's all the fun slash funny moments of that lifestyle being compressed into one day. And then they skip out all the boring stuff in between, like Excel spreadsheets and modeling and
Proofreading.
yeah, writing minutes. Yeah, exactly. Sending out emails about the minutes, reminding
Yeah.
people about the next meeting. Scheduling across time zones. All the unfun parts really don't, fit daytime TV, right? So, what do you think is real reality? So, you're implying like real reality is there's a lot more mundane stuff, right? Compared to Suits. Even though there's some things that ring true about this Suits thing. But what else did you learn about being a lawyer along the way that other people have misconceptions about?
Yeah. I think not so much misconceptions, but one of the things that left an impression on me was when I started working White Case in London under this guy called Richard Ewell and Ian Bagshaw. They were very innovative and creative and aggressive in the way they looked at service delivery. And that really kind of like changed my mindset about how things can work when you are delivering advice to people. So in Singapore, how I was trained was, you gotta put everything in technical, wonderful, chronological order, and it has to be a black and white and cover your ass. And then they were like, actually our clients do not like to read words. They want to see color, they want to see infographics. So we need to redesign how we deliver information to clients. We want it to be succinct and, not think the way things were done traditionally. So that was what was quite interesting for me. And I tried to sort of like implement it when I came back to Singapore. Myths about lawyers. I mean, whatever you read about lawyers being like drunkards and, stress from work and talk too much and all the evils they have, that's probably kind of true. Um, Although I do think that a disproportionate number of people really hate lawyers. So actually, we're quite nice people. I try not to tell people I'm a lawyer actually. So whenever people be like, "Oh, what do you do?" I pause and I'm like thinking for 5 seconds, should I say I'm a lawyer? Because then they'll frown and they'll be like, "I don't want to talk to her anymore."
So there you are, your Rachel, right? And don't worry, we're referring to, covering your donkey here, right? So that's why we're able to publish. But here we are talking about, the fact that there's this societal negative view of lawyers, right? Why is that negative view?
Well, it's partially true. Maybe the negative view is driven by the fact that we didn't really improve with times in some sense. I think people are always afraid of the hourly billing rates that we have and the bills that they see when it comes. They're like, oh my gosh, your 5 minute or 10 minute of checking the email cost me $300. So there's some truth behind it. And that's why people, generally speaking, find lawyers like a bit, in some sense, some people find them inefficient or, charging too much, too pricey. On the flip side, some people say, "Wow, that lawyer really saved my life. Without them, I would have gotten myself into huge trouble." So I think, we as a profession, we just need to innovate a bit more and try to find that nice balance in price point and service delivery that people today expect us. And then also maybe partially because of the rules that surround lawyers, we are not allowed to do a lot of things. So there's a disjunct between in communication, right? So we cannot exactly communicate and deliver what we want to tell clients in a way which we should do. So it's just a lot of traditional cultural things that we need to fix. Yeah. I mean, what is your experience with lawyers? Do you have any good lawyer best friends?
I do actually have some good lawyer best friends, actually. And, we do rib each other about it, right? And I also have very expensive lawyers that I paid a lot of money over the years for as well, who were friendly, right? As friendly as someone who is paying them, hundreds of thousands of dollars, will be, right? I think, there's two parts to it, right? And I think I resonate with that is like, the expense is really kind of like eye popping, right? Because, like we don't normally, as entrepreneurs or founders or even business folks, we don't really measure ourselves an hourly rate. We just work a lot, right? And to have someone bill us feels a bit like nickel and diming for everything, especially reading emails, things like that. So, I don't send an email to my analyst and say, hey, I read your question about what's going on, so I charge you X dollars. It's just kind of like, it makes the relationship very transactional in that sense.
Yeah.
And so the negative way of looking at it is like, it's nickel and diming. But I think the tricky part is that it moves it away from a relational partnership to a transactional one, right? And then it becomes like, how do I as a client get the most value from this lawyer which drives again the transactional nature of it more. And it also sometimes avoids the understanding of like what is the trust that we're trying to have here, what's the thing we're trying to deliver in as fast as possible, right? And I think the best lawyers I've worked with so far really build that trust, and on a relational side, and try to get to drive decisions, not to be process oriented, but like this is the document that we need because this is the business value we're trying to deliver, right? And so I think finding lawyers that understand the business as well as you do, and shaping the legal docs to be like that, versus, I think I had a horror story. One of the first startup lawyers I ever engaged was like the total opposite, right? They were trying to drive what we needed towards the templates they had, and definitely not listening to what we wanted to do. And we had won a large grant of money of their free services from a startup competition, at Harvard, and we just never got any value from them, right? At the end of the day, so it was just an interesting dynamic for that one. But I also do remember another in Singapore for my other business, engaging a lawyer, and again, it was like just the output just being terrible, and just basically saying that we just basically told them we're not going to use any of this, and don't charge us for any of it, and we had to get a third party to help, very quickly just articulate, like, we're not trying to be terrible people to be like, hey, we want to take this product and run, but it was just like, hey, this is totally not the spec, right? So it was anyway. So I think that's a really tricky part.
Yeah, I think my dad, when I was a kid, my dad was like, I asked my lawyer this question. He took like a long time to respond, and then he wrote an essay and then charged me 10,000 and didn't answer my question. So I think that kind of resonated in my head, even though I knew he didn't want me to become a lawyer. But things like that kind of like play an effect on my mind. The irony is that when we are training in law firms, that's actually how we are taught. We're taught to like write that long memo and deliver in this way, which is not exactly what some clients want, right? So it's trying to find the right fit. Yeah.
Yeah. And the tricky part for startups is that they're not like normal businesses, right? So they don't have the standard mechanics, right? So like, when you're a large company like a multinational corporation, you've been working for 5 years already, there's a standard point of contact, there are standard transactions that are being run, and there's a standard process of workflow, right? To get things there with the trust there. But with startups, it's like a totally different ball game. I mean, I also understand for my two startups, both times it was because I walked in with a totally different business to what they were expecting, right? And they just couldn't flex. But of course, the interesting part was they told me they could do it, so I just took them at their word, and then we didn't do it. so I guess I don't really blame myself, right? Because I didn't, I'm at the time a first time founder and a second time founder. Whereas for them, they must have seen lots of startups go through the door, so they were making that judgment call to tell me they could service me well. Anyway. So anyway, my key takeaway was, and what I learned from that experience was, you can only work with lawyers who have worked with startups before. And so if you're like a first-time founder and you have a seed stage company, you have to ask whether the partner you're working with has worked with seed stage startups, right?
Yeah.
And even better, they've worked in your field, right? Because the agreements for biotech is totally different from the agreements you're going to write for a marketplace terms of service, right? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, actually, that's the genesis of Founders Doc. So I think 4 years back, my friend raised 5 million in Singapore. And then he was looking for startup lawyers. Back then, I was working for, I mean, all my law firms are quite expensive. So I said, okay, let's sit down, and then I will write a request for fee proposal to 13 law firms with you, including the law firm that I was working in then. And then after going through all the 13 law firms in Singapore, he was not happy with any of the responses he received, because he's like, they don't really understand startups. And then he hired someone from Shanghai instead. But that person also had a shortfall in the sense that he couldn't sign up on Singapore law stuff. So, I mean, that was many years ago. That made me realize, like, hey, it's impossible that you reach out to 13 law firms, and he, as sort of like ambitious and a pretty good founder, couldn't find someone that supported him. And the other thing that was interesting for me, sort of like interacting with him, was one of his cornerstone investors was one of the key VC funds in Silicon Valley, so-called Founders Fund. And the way they approached investing in a startup was like mind blowing for me, because in traditional M&A, the investors like, I want these reserve matters and that board seat and that and that and that, and the agreement's got to be 40 pages long. They invested X amount of money in him, and then they were like, okay, this is my 7-page document. This is my due diligence process. I'll ask for 3 documents, and then we're good to go. So I was just kind of curious. I was like, wow, they can give you this amount of money with just this short form document. And then he was like, yeah, the mentality behind it is the VC fund wants to support the founder so that the founder has the maximum space to grow, and they do not want to clip their wings. So that got me thinking as well. I mean, back then, a vibrant startup community didn't not exist in Singapore, but since then we've sort of like grown in leaps and milestones. So now I think it is ripe to say that I want to support startups as a community. I cannot support every startup, but I think that there'll be a proportion of startups that I can sort of like look through their lenses and say this is why I think we need. The thing about startups is they grow really fast, and you choose the right one, they're actually really smart. So they figure a lot of things out themselves. In fact, I learned a lot of things from them. Luckily, they're not charging me hourly rates.
I can tell you as a startup founder that the ability to save a couple $100 if you do the legwork yourself is highly incentivizing for a founder to get smart and use the time well, right? Because
Yeah.
when I remember when I was a consultant and in a big company, like it gets charged to corporate, right? So you can take your time learning and asking the lawyers to do all the legwork and understanding it. Versus
Yeah.
as a founder, you're like, whoa, like I'm being charged an X per hour. Let me at least use Google and spend a couple hours reading right before the
Yeah.
meeting to make sure it's an efficient meeting as fast as possible.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting part you talked about, right? Which is that and I love the part where you said the 7-page document and 3 documents is the short form, right? And then for most founders, like, whoa, 7 pages legal document. That sounds like a long form to me.
Yeah. Yep. 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 I mean, I think there are some standard documents being thrown around in Singapore. And my first response as a nobody was like, I sat in front of my partner, then I was like, no founder is going to use it because it's too long. And then she was just like, no, you do not understand what you're talking about. This has been invested by all the top people in the world. And I was just like, no, a founder, time is the most valuable resource. They need to understand things. They're not stupid. They're very smart people, but not all founders, but most founders are smart people. And then they will pick things up really quickly, but you need to have a document that actually works for them. 40 pages not going to work, 15 pages. I mean, 7 pages to me is quite short, but you can say that it's too long for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my bias always tell people is like I always try to push for legal documents to be 1 page
Oh,
of
yes.
actual stuff because there's one more page which is all the preamble and all the stuff,
Yeah.
arbitration clauses, which are relatively standardized. So I always tell people like it's a 2-page document. 1 page is just signature fields and
Yeah.
dear X, and here's the address and all these other things.
Yeah.
But I think maximum is like 1 page of clauses, right? And I think the best lawyers also like frame it up from a positive angle. I think you raise a good point, right? Versus like reserve matters, which is a very defensive language, right? And I think that's a big differentiator between, I think, great startup lawyers and average to bad ones, right? Because I think the great ones are able to structure the language in a way where it feels straightforward. It still gets the protection that we need, but it doesn't trigger the other person to lawyer up, you know.
Mm,
Whereas
mm,
I think the weaker lawyers, they write in a way that is simplest to write because they're thinking about all the downside protections, but they end up causing the other person to lawyer up, right? And when the other person lawyers up to understand the contract, then they start generating fees and work and velocity by pushing for changes, right? And then the lawyers start sending stuff to each other, which
yeah.
is I can imagine awesome from a billable hours perspective, but like kind of like jaw dropping from like 2 founders or a founder and employee figuring stuff out, or a founder and a strategic partner, like they're just trying to get the deal done. And then
Yeah.
suddenly we spent 2 weeks with the lawyers emailing each other and we're still not
Yeah.
really closer, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a tough spot I think a lot of founders have discovered.
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on who you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a private equity fund or a corporation, they're not going to accept a two-page document. And but if you're dealing with founders, where it's always a risk reward thing, right? If your company has not even started, and you guys are ideation stage or very early stage, then I don't think it's worth being too chonghei over things. But at the same time, I've also been in sort of like late stage startups where every clause matters. And the fact that the other lawyer does not want to accept one sentence actually had implications, like they were trying to hide something. So those are rare instances, which I try to avoid, but yeah, it happens.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, right? Which is that it's really about the right amount of legal judgment between protection and simplicity, but also it changes with the life stage of the company, right? So, and I think the tricky part is, I think obviously if your company is the size of Google, then you can use lawyers the way that you use any other lawyer to some extent.
I think they have their own law firm actually. There's so many lawyers, they can call themselves a Google law firm.
Exactly, right. There's so many in-house lawyers dealing with the regulators, dealing with like court opinions and so forth. And so I think the converse is really at the other end of the scale, right? Your first-time founders doing their pre-seed and seed investments, and then doing their Series A. I think those are the two sets of periods where I think simplicity of documents is really important, and I think that's why we saw safe notes really become super popular, not just in YC, but Silicon Valley and even globally, right? Because of that simplicity. Could you share a little bit more about what you think about safes and how they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, a safe in case is a great idea. In Singapore, we have the SVCA's CARE document as well. My general sense, I mean, you are an investor yourself, but some of the investors that I meet are still not comfortable with the safe and kiss because they're too short. Um, so it really depends on who you're dealing with. If they really are able to understand and are willing to take the risk with the $50,000, $100,000 investment, then the safe is the way to go. But even within the safe and kiss regime, there are very many different variations like discount, no discount, debt versus equity. So founders just need to be aware about what they are signing themselves up to. Not just like negotiating strongly for everything, but just knowing what you're signing up so that you know how to, proceed in your next capital fundraising exercise. You know what will happen if, your company doesn't do well. Um, in Southeast Asia, things are a bit different, I think, from Silicon Valley because in Silicon Valley, people have the very aggressive risk, they have very high appetite for risk. Versus in Southeast Asia, a lot of the funds you raise are from family and friends. The community is very small. If you burn bridges, it's not a nice feeling. So some founders actually come up to me and say, which is rare for startups, but they'll be like, after in 3 years' time, if we are not able to raise our next round, we want to be able to give it back to them at 3% interest or something because they want to maintain the good relationship. So I think that is how Southeast Asia sort of like is a bit different from the other regions. The family, the close connections amongst the communities is something that you just want to be careful about. Yeah, not burning bridges. Yeah.
Yeah, those are really important points you raised, right? Which is about how Silicon Valley is different from the rest of the world in terms of their risk appetite, and then the second, of course, is like acknowledging that Singapore is a small community, right? So people know people, right? And it's not just legal dynamics, but it's also reputational risk, right?
Yeah. I mean, I could kind of like categorize the founders that I see over the years in Singapore in three categories. So one category is your ex-Ivy League guys who came to Singapore to start their businesses. So them and their investors would likely be from Silicon Valley or Silicon Valley influence, and they're much more open to safe and kiss notes and whatever that's short. You have a second category, which is your third generation kids. So, the family started traditional businesses and they want to build a name for themselves. They want to do something techy. So those questionable. And on the flip side, you also have family offices investing in startups. So those I find tend to be a bit more traditional because they're still not comfortable. They're in traditional M&A space before. They're still not comfortable with the 7-page document. They want to have a bit more skin in the game, and they also want the founders a bit more skin in the game. And the relationship is quite strong. And the third category is hustlers who did very well, serial entrepreneurs. They either raise funds from any of the two categories before or institutional money. And if you raise money from your sovereign linked funds or whatnot, you're probably not going to fly with a safe note. I'm not too sure about that, but the last I checked, I don't think that's possible.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And I think that's a pretty good summary, especially I think, at least to me, I feel like the trend is really with category 1, right? And to some extent, category 3, right? The category of like, American capital that's kind of like cascading across the world from the, zero interest rate, printing policy, cascading into, the US funds coming to Southeast Asia, but cascading as US LPs into regional funds as well. And I think also, when I meet all the new founders, they're all like, they're reading, Paul Graham and Y Combinator and reading a bunch of stuff in the States, which, I think they should, right? Because it's free information. So, they're getting smart on it. And because of that, I think they have a very strong bias to say like, hey, like safe notes are something I understand. And someone actually took the time to explain this to me, not just their blog post, but a whole ecosystem of blog posts on Quora and websites and magazines. So I can actually understand what each term means and read up, right? Whereas I think the issue with some of these like more local standard notes is they don't have that same ecosystem of explanation, let alone champions of those documents, right? So I think that's a big challenge, I would say.
Yeah, actually, between the 1 and 3, I kind of like the 2 the most. But I think all of us have our own preferences. If I spoke to someone else, they'd be like, "Oh, we like the 3," especially the more traditional guys. They'd be like, "Yeah, 3 is the best. 3 is the institutional one, sovereign linked ones." 2 actually is the one that I track along a lot more. And surprisingly, a lot of the family offices are currently very interested in investing in startups. So I think that's a space to be watched.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there are different paths to be a founder, and also I think what you're articulating also is different types of capital that's out in the market, right? And it's a bit of a multi-sided, matching process, and lawyers are the middlemen in that process. You've been talking a little bit about, and I've noticed you kind of like being, in many ways an expert to founders about what are the local legal documents and standards. So would you happy to share like maybe your like, high level summary of how, first time founders to evaluate safe and care, what would your, like high level articulation of the trade-offs would be?
So I think the first thing the founder needs to care about when they first launch a business will not be legal. The first thing is, even for me, right, when I first started my founder's doc, is just launch it and then get a consumer response. So I would say like if it's your first time doing a startup, just focus on getting consumers or getting a product market fit before you spend money on legal. It's always a risk reward thing, right? If you only have 2 consumers and you spent $5,000 on legal documents, then it's just a waste of money. So make sure you get your product market fit right first before you put any more money in it, whether is it legal or anything else actually. And that is the lean startup model, right? Which I think is quite useful actually. And then the second thing is then you kind of need to get your in-house documents in order. So, terms and conditions, privacy policy, just anything risky from a perspective. It differs from industry to industry. So if you're an influencer, then your risk lies in someone bad mouthing you or, non-disparagement clause. And then safe and kids only comes in when you're fundraising. So fundraising is very dependent on your investors and what kind of industry you're in. Which also dictates what kinds of investors are interested in you. If you are in traditional F&B business or nothing so tech related, your investors will most likely be a more traditional minded investor, and they will ask for they may even ask for a shareholders agreement. a full-fledged one. So just be prepared for that. But if you are in a very tech-focused business, and your investors are from Silicon Valley inspired, then you can start thinking about Safe and Kiss. To be honest, Safe and Kiss, they do look quite alike. The only difference is things like, is it going to be equity or debt? So I mean, equity means, when they convert, they can only convert into shares. With a debt element in it is to say that, after the expiry of, let's say, 3 years, the investors can ask for your money back. It really depends on the terms of negotiation at that point in time. Yeah, I would say, like, just try to understand what you're signing. That's all. There's no good or bad.
Right. And when you say about safe and kiss and all the way up to the shareholder agreement, what do you also think about cares?
I think it can be a bit shorter, maybe, and also it is a good start to standardizing documents. But I think there are some provisions which maybe we can discuss a bit further. So I think it's a very good message that we want to give founders a document they can start with, but maybe a bit of understanding about founders and the risk that they're taking could be helpful as well. So
Let's
yeah.
go into what those topics should be discussed, into the cares from your perspective.
I mean, one of the clauses that have raised eyebrows amongst founders, I mean, it's a great instrument drafted by wonderful people, but things like most favored nation clauses, I think some people signed it without knowing what it was. And it kind of pains my heart a little bit because as a founder myself, I know the kind of risk you're taking to start your business. And, it pains my heart to see when they realize that they're either handcuffed in some sense or they didn't know what they were getting into. So I think we can probably try and find a compromise between the two. I also see where the investors are coming from and the concerns that they have in terms of protecting capital that they are investing on behalf of other people. So from that perspective, I also perhaps also actually think the safe and kiss may be a bit aggressive for Southeast Asia. So I think eventually there'll be a middle ground that people use. In fact, I still have quite a number of people investing $1, $2 using a shareholders agreement, full-fledged shareholders agreement. What about you? What are your thoughts about the care?
Well, I haven't used that instrument. I've used Safe for sure, and I've elevated between Safe and Kiss. Yeah, I think the crux for every legal document is: does the founder, with his limited time and limited legal budget, right, understand what the person is signing, right? Because, and obviously there's a bunch of like wishy-washy stuff to be like, buyer beware,
Yeah.
caveat emptor kind of like dynamic, which I kind of get when you're trying to be very transactional. But it just is, I think, very short-sighted. And I think there's a phrase they use, right? It's like you want to be like long-term greedy, like you want to be thinking about how do you create the most upside over the long term, and that normally implies like some sort of win-win, transparency, trust dynamic. And that's especially true for startups, right? Where like you're expecting the founder to really do a hockey stick, right?
Yeah.
Of their growth, and if not, to keep trying, right? And if they along the way 1 year down the road suddenly have a chat with Rachel and suddenly realize that the contract was not what they thought they had signed,
It
it leaves a
happens a lot,
bad
actually.
taste. It happens a lot, right? I'm sure, right? Like that's probably like all your business is probably like people walking to you because they finally have a budget to talk to you, and they finally have enough of a network to get in reach contact with you, and then they realize, oh no, like I was suspicious about this clause then, and I had no idea why I signed,
Yeah, by the
right?
way, talking to me is free. I don't charge for the hour as well. So, so
Oh, see, that's every founder who's listening to this podcast right now is like very happy right now.
actually, it kind of goes both ways. I've seen investors signing convertible loan. They invested like 600,000 or 800,000 using convertible loan note term sheets, which they didn't even know what the terms were. And the conversion for your convertible loan note is an IPO, so they also didn't know. So it's like a two-way thing. I also think what we want to strike is something that's fair, not necessarily that is one-sided. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly true. So what's interesting is that there's been like a bell curve of founders who are currently higher performing and founders that are currently lower performing, right? And then on another scale, there are also found investors who are high performing investors and are currently lower performing investors, right? And so that's kind of like ends up shaping it into like the negotiation, right? And the negotiation gets boiled down into the economic rights as well as the control rights in the document. That's really the heart of this legal document, right? And this is fluctuating negotiation, right? That is in motion. And I think it's interesting because you see lawyers are on both sides of this transaction, uh, being that intermediary and trying to shape that negotiation to a close, right? Uh, what tips would you have for founders in terms of how they should conduct the process of that thing? Uh, my tip has always been to focus on the trust building side.
Mm.
But I don't know what advice you would normally give founders as they kind of like enter that process. Yeah.
That's a really, really, really good tip because I mean that's what the Southeast Asian fabric I call is about. But I would always say know what you want before you go in because I think sometimes founders just want the money in and they just be like, oh, let's just sign it and let's get it over. And then that round, they're fine. The next round or the bridge round, they're stuck. So I think, just know what you want and maybe plan a little bit ahead. So you plan for this round, the bridge round, and the next round and then know where your end game is so that when you conduct your current capital fundraising, you will not be stuck in future. And the second thing is evaluate your investors the same way they're evaluating you, right? Because they are going to be the people that you're going to work with for a pretty long time. And if they're going to be aggressive from day one, then it's the dating phase. You can choose your boyfriend. So choose it right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's more than choosing a boyfriend or girlfriend because when you sign the legal contract, it's a 7 year, 10 year document. I think it's closer to a marriage actually. Once you get into the legal thing, and actually, I think you said something that's very true, right? Which is knowing what you want before you go in is a tough decision for a lot of founders because they're working on the business, they're working on the customers, they're working on themselves and their own psychology of fear, right? And FOMO and scarcity, right? And it's tough to know in the midst of your own, especially first time founders, to learn that. I think it's easier once you've been a second time or third time founder because you know all these documents inside out by then. But I also really like what you said about picking investors, right? I think the way I talk about it is like, would you hire this person to be on your team? That's what I tell founders. Like, would you? I mean, because everyone's very picky about their, head of VP of sales or you know, um, the chief of staff or like the marketing lead. Like everyone's very focused on like culture fit and everything. And then suddenly you're like, like you said, they're not applying the same standards, the high standards they have for hiring an employee to effectively hiring an investor, right, to join the board, which will be important both in the good times and creating the conditions for the good times, but also there will be tough times, and that's where it's going to be really make or break, right? If you have the right investors or the wrong investors on board. Awesome, Rachel. So, starting to wrap things up here, could you share with us a time when you were brave?
I think my bravest moment was probably to do law instead of medicine because I knew that my dad really wanted all his children to become doctors. And then after that, continuing to be a very strong headed female lawyer because my workplace is quite male dominated. And some people will view me as a female rather than a lawyer. So setting the record straight is quite important for me.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. And I really appreciate you, doing everything that you have been to articulate and be the bridge between law and startups, right? So I'd love to kind of like share at least the three things that really jumped out at me, based on our conversation, right? First of all, I was really struck by, I think the fact that, your frankness about your journey towards being a lawyer and what you learned from being a lawyer and what you gain in terms of skills. But also the areas of improvement for the legal industry, right? And I think that's a pretty fair point of view because I think a lot of people don't really understand what lawyers do or who lawyers are, right? Other than, like you said, watching Suits, or which is a positive, fun version of it versus the big bad evil lawyers in other movies, right? And I think the second thing that I really appreciate, of course, was I think the dive that you and I did around kind of like really what I call the founder trade-offs in terms of being someone who has to start building customers, but also start thinking about the fundraising and the legal documentation associated with that. So I think lots of helpful, handy tips on safe notes, KISS, CARE, and some of the regional differences and things to watch out for. And then I think thirdly, of course, thank you so much for sharing with us your own entrepreneurial journey, really kind of like spearheading that bridge dynamic, right, between the legal profession and the startup vocation. And I think that's a huge piece because I think the more we have great lawyers like you helping bridge that gap and having that founder psychology, I think the more investors win and the more founders will win over the long term. So I think that's amazing.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jeremy. And it's great. The podcast is great. And I mean, I'm not a great lawyer yet. I'll be there with the help of you guys. It's going to be a two-way process. I learn from you guys learn from me. And hopefully we can work together to create a more robust startup community in Singapore and Southeast Asia.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share this episode with friends and colleagues. Sign up at www.jeremyau.com to discuss this episode with other community members in our forum. Stay well and stay brave.